Hi, I'm Andy Ellis. I'm the host of this show and a potential Green Party candidate for governor of Maryland in 2026. I'm using this show to highlight interesting people and ideas that help me and you to understand what is happening and what is possible. You can learn more about the campaign by going to gogreen2026.com. Guests on this show do not necessarily support my campaign or the Green Party. They've agreed to come on to discuss ideas and issues. And of course, click the subscribe button on YouTube so you can keep up to date with this podcast. Hello and welcome to the Go Green 2026 podcast. Many conversations about electoral politics start at the highest level and then move down. President, senator, governor, mayor, etc. But tonight we're going to be focusing on a very local level of politics, and we're going to have a conversation about school boards. School boards around the nation have become a place of intense conflict yet again, as a new wave of often conservative movements seek to use these spaces as a means of advancing what they call parents' rights. Maryland has seen some of this activity, but not as much as other states. In Maryland, every county and Baltimore City have a board of education at least partially elected in a nonpartisan election. And starting in 2022, Baltimore City elected 2 citywide positions of the Board of School Commissioners. Ash Esposito is a working mom, an artist, and advocate for educational equity and social justice, and was elected to the Board of School Commissioners for Baltimore City Public Schools in 2022. Ash is deeply committed to addressing systemic issues affecting marginalized communities and is passionate about community engagement, ethical data usage, grassroots democracy, voting rights, inclusive campaigning, and politics. Welcome, Ash. How are you doing tonight?
Pretty good.
Good.
Thanks for
Good.
having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. I want to get into school board stuff and all of that, but first, let me ask. It's been raining here for it seems like days. Do you think it's ever going to stop?
I don't know. It's so soggy out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everywhere we go, there's standing water, and the chickens are very unhappy about it, and I am too. So I hope by the time this weekend comes, it's a little bit better.
Yeah, Vinny's not happy about it either. He jumped in a puddle with Crocs on the other day and was like, "Oh my gosh, my feet." So I had to like run in and get him some socks because I was like, "Yeah, it's gross out." So I shall carry you.
Well, fair enough. Well, hopefully we get through that and we have a good weekend, and we can get back to normal springtime weather. Um,
Yeah.
so let's get to this. You were one of the first elected school board members in Baltimore City. First, before we talk about your race, how did Baltimore City only get elected school board members in 2022?
I heard because I wasn't here at the time. Like I know folks that have been a part of that fight for a really long time. I believe it was passed in 2016. Was it Cheryl Glenn passed it? And I actually talked to one of her former staffers, and they gave me a piece of encouragement, and they said that the way that I'm showing up back then when she was having conversations privately about like how the seat should be run, like I'm basically they were telling me I'm doing it right. And I was like, "Thank you," because I feel like my hair's on fire. I don't know.
Yeah. And so your office is citywide, right? Like you were
Yeah.
elected by the whole city of Baltimore.
Yes. Yeah. And that is tough.
I I imagine it is, and I want to get into some of that in a minute. But let me start. Why did you decide to run for school board?
Well, I when I was 17 years old, this is a whole rant, but when I was 17 years old, when I was in the foster care system, I was watching, I think I've always had like a good read on systemic stuff, but also like recognizing that like if you speak up and even if you like make people mad a little bit, um, you can fix things because if nobody speaks up, then it just keeps going the way that it's going. And so when I was in the foster care system, I had a bunch of different placements. It was really chaotic. A lot of us had really terrible experiences. And so, as a very, very shy person back then, I think that that's like the moment where I kind of like found my voice as like a youth advocate. And so, the more I spoke up, the more I changed things. I ended up becoming a foster parent trainer in a way. So, as people were going through the process of becoming foster parents, I would go and like talk to them and say like, hey, like this is the route that you're going, but remember, like, we're real people that, need support. Like, we just want people to love us and support us and keep us safe. So that was a really powerful moment. And I think from then, like, that's how I got my first job, was advocating for myself. And so trying to go to college after being someone that didn't have a good education experience was really difficult. And so that was always like a hurdle that I was trying to overcome, because I graduated from high school with a cumulative 1.4 GPA. I had to go to night school, to take extra classes to like graduate on time. So it was pretty rough. And at the time, I had undiagnosed learning differences and tried to go to college, even though people told me that I would not be successful. I wasn't successful, and I ended up failing out a bunch of times. But ultimately, that brought me to University of Maryland Global Campus, which ended up being the school that I would graduate from. And not only did they make all their books uh, online and readable by text to voice software, I also got a diagnosis, and then I got on their student advisory council. And so in 2021, I had graduated and I had just rolled off of the University System of Maryland councils and representing University of Maryland Global Campus as a returning adult with the barriers that I had. And I saw I was able to do really good policy work. I got more civically involved locally. So I was a member of the Votes Coalition. So the legislation that passed, giving the student member more voting rights and also studying compensation for school board members, came out of that coalition. So it just happened that I was in this place. I applied for one of the appointed seats, and my resume, obviously the background that I just gave, my resume will not stack up against someone who typically serves on a school board. And they were like, "This is competitive. That's cute." So when I saw that there was like elected seats, I was like, you know what? I love being told no, because now I'm going to run for it. And it just seemed like, given my background, I felt like I could bring a different perspective. And even though running for office like scared the crap out of me, and I had a toddler, I just decided to do it, and it worked out.
Yeah, and I mean, I love that origin story. It's like, your superheroes have their origin stories,
Yeah.
about how they got to be in the position that they're in, and I love your sort of how you became an elected official, origin story, because I think it's not a path that everybody thinks would work. I think there's a lot of folks that would tell you no along that path, and like you say, those being told no is like sort of become fuel for you to push forward. So after you decided to run, how did you approach the campaign? What did you want to do in the campaign? How did you run it? How was it? How did you look at it, different than most campaigns?
As someone who had a pandemic baby, I had been involved with campaigns prior to having a baby, but during the pandemic, the blessing in disguise that happened is that everybody was forced to slow down. One, two, everybody was forced to stay home and make things accessible virtually. So I was able to like text bank, while Vinny was like taking a nap, which kind of like gave me something to do, because just a very hyper person in general. So it's like when I have downtime, like I'm like cleaning, like doing stuff. But that was like a fun way to be like civically involved. And so from that also contributed to how I looked at like community work and making things accessible to my neighbors. When I was doing work in Violetville, one of the things that happened is that I found out that a bunch of people didn't go to meetings because of the time. Parents couldn't go to meetings because, that's dinner time or that's bedtime. And there were folks that had lived in the neighborhood for decades but couldn't go to meetings because they had mobility issues. And then there's just people that just have social anxiety. And I found those folks too. So I think accessibility was like a big part of how I wanted to run it. And I
Mhm.
also I like doing things that are goofy. So I remember I had a little refrigerator and I'm like, submit your artwork. I don't know how that landed. I don't think it really got that much traction because, I'm just like winging it. So I built my website. I was doing graphics. Luckily, I have a background in that stuff. So, I didn't have to pay for those things. So I really was very clear and intentional about the branding. I've created my own logo. And it was just really fun, like sitting in my house and just like crafting all this stuff. So that was my first approach to the campaign, was being very like social media and like communications heavy, because I knew, like, being a mom, I gotta find what my strength is. I may not be able to go canvassing every single day. I'm on Vinny's time. So if Vinny doesn't feel good, how can I do things at home that will keep the ball rolling, but meet me where I'm at. So that was kind of how I approached the campaign. And then I found a running mate, which was really cool, because that was kind of like the other piece of it. So I think that there was in the campaign, there was a bit of like a tug of war, because being a data nerd too, one of the things that I notice is that certain precincts that have low voter turnout also have a low number of super voters. So as people are running their campaigns, they're less likely to canvass those communities. And over time, it accidentally disenfranchises, or accidentally on purpose disenfranchises, voters by misusing data and trying to more focus on like viability. And I feel like that's like an ableist approach. So
Yeah, I
yeah,
want to talk about that because I think that's fascinating. I think that your approach, one of the things I remember you talking about during your campaign was that the approach to narrowing down the electorate with the super voters meant the same people were electing the same people all the time. And so you, I know, like wanted to go against that and did go against that. Before we get,
right.
can you talk? First of all, can you define for folks who may not know how the term super voter is used, and then talk about how you reached people who might be those super voters, but you also reached other people?
Yeah, so super voters are people that have in their voter history, they have turned out both in the primary and general election for the last two voting cycles. And sometimes it varies. Some people will be like just the last voting cycle, but it's basically looking at, of the pool of voters, when you go to Board of Elections and get a voter file, it includes their voter history. And so a lot of systems that are built and just people that are managing campaigns filter out the folks that look to be a sure thing. Like they're absolutely going to turn out. At least that's what the data tells them. But when I looked at like the age and also where super voters were concentrated, like they were concentrated in the white L, they tended to be older voters. And when I just went back into like storytelling mode, I'm like, say I'm a super voter, you know, say I'm 70 years old. I've always voted every election since I was 18 years old. I'm always going to get a piece of literature. I'm always going to get a knock on my door, and I'm going to get approached by multiple candidates. So I get to pick which one I like the best. And then I thought about the flip side of that. Say I'm not a super voter. So that means I'm a young person. I'm someone who just moved to the area, possibly. I'm an immigrant. Um, or I'm just somebody that's lost interest in the electoral process because I never get a piece of literature and I never get a knock on my door because there's not enough super voters in my community. So my approach was thinking about those groups that are left out of the situation. Imagine what it would feel like to get a knock on your door for the first time, or to get a piece of literature and somebody really take the time to try to, pull you into either the campaign or the political process. Like, even if you don't support that person, just having the outreach and, you know, being told when election day is, like, here's how you get your ballot. Like, there's so much information that is shared by candidates. So the nature of running a campaign, I feel like, has a direct correlation with voter turnout.
Mhm.
So if we're not running our campaigns to be inclusive, then that is why, like, we were losing public trust, and also we have such a low turnout in the city.
Yeah, and I mean, the turnout for, I think turnout in the 2022 primary election was like 27% or something like that. And what that means is that 1 in 4 voters at best are getting approached by most campaigns, and as that number gets lower and lower, the group of people that most campaigns are approaching gets lower and lower. So it's we're not even, people in Baltimore will say that primary is the only election that matters, but that's not the case in the school board election. Like in the school board election, you have 2 rounds that are both narrowing. It's almost like a top 2 type of situation. And I think
Right.
what's interesting about it is you not only said, I think there's a problem, there's an opportunity in the data, but then you structured your campaign to go talk to those folks and to go talk to
Mhm.
people who were outside of the super voter area. At what point did you know it was working?
Honestly, you know what's funny? This is going to sound really wild. So before I officially filed, I talked to C, my husband, and I was like, I think I want to run. Like, what do you think? And he's like, I think you'll win. Because he knows like how I am with like data stuff, but also I'm like I have ADHD. Like I'm into so many different things. And so and I think even maybe you said this too, like you saw there were people that I knew that you didn't know that I knew from like different areas and stuff like that. So it's also leveraging the relationships that you already have.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I think that's another piece that's really interesting that people forget about when they run. They focus on people that are strangers. It's like leverage the folks that you already know, because sometimes those are the folks that fall into the bucket of like not being super voters.
Yeah,
And
and
those are people that you already have relationships with.
in many cases, those are people that have their own communities they have influence with and things like that. And so I think that the approach that you took of networking inside and outside the existing political channels is a really interesting one, and I think it's one we need to think about in grassroots politics because to me, when I think about grassroots politics, it is how do we engage more of the people to make more of the decisions and be more empowered through voting. And if we're only narrowing the electorate down to these people who voted in the last election, we're losing the opportunity to change outcomes, change coalitions, and change different movements. So I think it's really interesting that you took this strategy that went against the conventional wisdom. I'm sure that anybody who was advising you was like, no, stick to the super voters. We know this works, you know.
Yeah, and part of the argument too is like they're like, "Oh, it's expensive to try to reach everybody." I was like, "It depends on what method you're using,
Yeah.
because not everything's expensive." And the other, well, I won't give away too many of my secrets because I'm like, hire me as a campaign manager.
Yeah.
But there's other ways to do it too, because like one of the most underestimated, I think, forms of communication to leverage like during a campaign is word of mouth.
Hmm.
Like, I mean, my community, oh my gosh, like if something happens on one end of my community, like everybody knows about it. And it's by word of mouth via, social media channels. Like the delivery may be a different source, like maybe phone or whatever. But yeah, like hit every angle possible. Try multiple channels. Like I don't think that any one way works or doesn't work.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody who is running this cycle for a city council seat recently, and I was talking to them about this, and I said like, I asked them this question about super voters, and I said, "Are you knocking the door of every voter or of super voters?" And they're like, "Oh, we have data, we're sorting it out, et cetera, et cetera." And I was like, "When you're walking down a block of row houses, and your sheet tells you that you're only supposed to knock 3 of them, why not just walk door to door to door to door?" Because the amount that you're going to be able to talk, the amount of people you're going to be able to talk to in that time, like you're almost trying, it's almost like making it too complicated, right? Like
Right.
it's like there are people that live in those houses and there are 50 of them on this block and you can go talk to each of them and nobody else is talking to them, and
And that right there, I remember I went with another candidate to canvass my neighborhood. And I remember they were using that approach. Of course, I didn't cut the data or anything like that. I don't even like to use data really when I canvass.
yeah.
I just like to like go out, like I'll talk to people all over the place. Like I don't even need to know your name. I will just give you some information or I'll like, yeah, there's all kinds of crazy tactics that I use during the campaign. But what you also do by skipping doors is that people, first of all, if you knock on my neighbor's door, I can hear it.
Right.
So I'm gonna go to my window and be nosy. And if I see you had the nerve to skip my door, and
Yeah.
then my neighbor tells me later, like, oh yeah, the so and so who's a
You got a
candidate
t-shirt on,
stopped
you're
by.
leaving literature everywhere and you skip your door. Right.
Yeah, so it's like I'm absolutely not voting for you because why skip my door? What's why is my door not good? You know what I mean? Like for voters, it doesn't make any sense. But you just see people And I've seen canvassers do this too, where they're canvassing a neighborhood and they're hyper focused on their phone and like knocking certain doors, and there's people on the street who
Right.
are like curious. You can see it on their face, they're curious, but the person is so unaware and so like head down that they're not like, hey, like I love talking to people that are just like out and about.
Yeah. And when I ran in 2018, I knocked on super voters' doors, but I also knocked on people who might not vote in a primary or might vote in a general election. And so
Or
many
might
of them
not even
were,
be registered.
or might not even be registered. And so many of these folks are, oh my gosh, no politicians ever come by here. And then
Right.
they had stuff to share that was really useful, and like helped me to be able to understand what I needed to do to win their vote, but to also win their neighbors' votes. And it's like it's not just you're missing an opportunity to get a voter. You're missing an opportunity to get insight, and you're missing an opportunity to get perspective. And maybe the person who doesn't vote regularly has a perspective that the politician needs to hear. And it's like I think that part of it. It's not just a numbers game to get new numbers. It's a way to get a real genuine perspective of all the people you're seeking to represent. And I really appreciate that your focus on that strategy, because I think once you got down the road of it and they realized what you were doing, the folks that were the traditional consultants and things like that, there was nothing they could do to catch up because you had already been talking to a bunch of people well before they ever knew about it.
Right, or I had, like, relationships with people that they didn't know
Yeah.
relationships with, that, that's the one thing I love too, like, I gotta give a shout out to the moms, like, the moms that were like, "Oh, give me some of your literature, and I will go out, in my neighborhood and, like or wherever I'm going and hand it out and stuff." Like, and that's why I have a struggle when it comes to, like, organizing spaces too, because everybody says you have to, like, build yourself to be an organizer. First of all, everybody's human beings. We don't have to like develop that muscle per se, because the best organizers I've ever seen are pissed off moms. A group
Hmm.
of pissed off moms know how to phone bank, text bank, mobilize, protest, and they know how to do that naturally. So I don't think that I think that we're overcomplicating campaigns.
Yeah.
It's like instead of looking at everybody as numbers, these are human beings. These are your neighbors. Just talk to them. Like don't reduce it to numbers.
You mentioned Cheryl Glenn earlier, and in 2018, I ran against Cheryl Glenn, and one of the things that she said was, "I don't know why y'all do all this stuff with data and figuring out which doors to talk on. Just knock on the doors and talk to the people." And I thought that old school approach was really useful advice for me at the time, because I'm a data person too, and I'm like, well, I've got my app here, and it says that person, da, 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 and it's like the amount of work we put into these walk sheets and these apps and these types of things is almost like, sometimes, not always, if you're running a presidential there's certain elections where I think that stuff makes sense because you have the resources to manage it, whatever, right? But for most of these local elections and most even state elections, like that type of thing, feels like it is overkill in a sense, when the reality is get out there and talk to people and let them know what you're about and how they can get involved. And not to look, we could do a whole show on canvassing and campaigning and which list to use and things like that. But I think the point you're making here is about overcomplication is a really good one. At the end of the day, the job of a person who is seeking votes is to get the input of the people whose vote they're seeking and to talk to
Right.
them, you know.
Right. Right.
Um,
And that's where I've also struggled with coalition groups, because coalition groups did definitely show up for me too. But I also have critiques of that process, like when we're talking about endorsements and stuff. One of the biggest pushbacks that I had recently was when I was asking folks to not start your endorsement process until after the filing deadline. Like, so inclusion goes both ways. It's in being inclusive of voters, but also being inclusive of all candidates. Because if you truly believe in a democratic process, what harm happens from us in coalition spaces, like kind of gatekeeping, being the kingmaker via endorsements too.
right, and I think the power of feeling like a kingmaker, um, is like, I think there's a lot of folks who want to use the tactics of the establishment political organizations and want to use the canvassing tactics, want to use the endorsement tactics, and sort of get at the inside from the outside a little bit. But oftentimes it is just another version of the inside. It's just a new
Right.
room that is sort of being constructed around where the discussion can occur.
And there is harm that happens. I mean, like I know even with my election, I found out after the fact that some of the candidates that had beef with me because of like some endorsement shenanigans that I definitely wasn't a part of. But so it does hurt people. It's just like just make it as democratic and as transparent as possible because people do like take those things into consideration when they're voting,
Mhm.
but often like don't know how those endorsements actually are processed.
Yeah.
Um,
And,
yeah,
and I think people, the ballot is big, it's complicated. There's candidates all up and down it, there's ballot questions all up and down it, there's central committee elections sometimes. And most working people, I think, don't have the time to research all 15 pages of the ballot or something like that. There's people who do. There's working people who do, but I think most folks are taking advice from the people they trust. They're taking advice from the organizations they trust, and they may look at the races they care about. But there's a lot on the ballot, and I think those organizations serve an important role, but I think you're right that people don't know how those decisions were made. And oftentimes when they see that, they're upset about it. They're like, wait a second, why didn't you hear that guy out? You know?
right,
Um,
right.
and so, yeah, I think you bringing light on on those things is really interesting. And so you won. You won two sets of elections. You won a primary, and then you won a general election. Um, what do you think was the key to you winning? And you got the most votes, right?
Yeah, yeah.
What do you think was
That's
the key to
crazy.
you? What do you think was the key thing that made it so that you won and became the first one of the first two citywide elected school commission?
I mean, I think it's a combination of things, like, because when I meet folks that I don't know that have voted for me, a lot of times it's my background, it's my story. Sometimes it's that I am invested in the school system and have a kid, like, Vinny's getting enrolled in pre-K next year. Um, some of it is name recognition, some of it's like, all types of things. Some of it's endorsement, some of it was um coalition groups and like existing relationships. I think conditions happen to be perfect. And also I was very intentional about wanting to run a positive campaign, like a silly campaign. Like I was serious, but like
But
when I
fun.
did see moments to like have humor, because I mean I was talking about like heavy stuff during the campaign, but I wanted to balance it out. So that was, I don't know. I think it's a lot of stuff because it's also funny too because I remember there was a forum that we did and they asked us a question that was like really tough because it was like, "Oh, your kid doesn't have a teacher. What do you do?" And I was like, "That sounds terrible and that sounds like a lost cause. Like what do you mean what do I do?" And I think being that blunt like helped me in a weird way because I remember people that were like close to me and stuff were like, "Oh my gosh, like you're bombing." But there were people that were there that were like, "Yeah, like what do you do with that?" And
Right.
also like, I don't know. It was just funny. So I think all the stars were aligned. Shenanigans were happening and I happened to win.
All right. Well, I think that is a humble interpretation of it, but I appreciate that that's the interpretation you're offering. I'd love we can do a whole nother show when we get into tactics and numbers and all the stuff. But I want to switch a little bit here and talk about and pick up on that point that you talked about coalitions a little bit. So, what was it like after you won and you had to govern? What were the limits and possibilities of that coalition that helped you to, helped in your election?
I think because I had been in the coalition spaces as a coalition member, like driving policy and like, collaborating and like, working as a team, like, I'm used to more of, like, a co-governance structure because, like, when I was running, one of the things that I said to folks is I was like, "Even though I may be, like, physically sitting in the seat, like, this is our seat." So, it doesn't mean that I'm just in there, saying, "I know what's best," on behalf of, like, every single, resident in the city. It means, like, reach out to me, tell me what's going on, keep me informed, I'll reach out to you. Like, so more of a collaborative process, and I've seen that a lot with, like, folks that are just, like, parents in the community or, like, students and stuff. But I think the struggle with the coalition groups is that the coalition groups are so, like, intertwined with political, shenanigans that it's like a lot of that shifted to the next election cycle, but I think that that was, like, kind of like a shock because one, of course, I knew, like, I've had a lot of resources to help me, like, get, like, learn how to do the job, get, like, onboarded, crashing and burning sometimes. But that co-governance thing I think is really important because there's issues happening parallel to my term on the school board that I'm not necessarily seeing, and I hear from the coalition groups when it reaches a peak and when it's an issue, but there's a whole history that I wasn't, like, informed about. So it's like I'm constantly having to play catch up, and what I think that would help both parties, like the coalition and the folks on the school board, especially me, like, being an elected member, is having more, like, conversations about, like, are the things that we're working on aligned, or is there an intersection of the things that we're working on, and how do we, like, collaborate, and what context do I need to know when things come up, um, so that I can keep an eye out for it. Like, so I think that's the struggle is, like, everybody's views are, like, going, like, different places, but it's not necessarily, like, aligned. Um,
And it
and I do
doesn't.
think that there's more power in, like, a co-governance structure, but that's not how most people serve in their seats.
Yeah, I think most people would agree with you theoretically. Of course, a co-governance structure is important, but here and now we have to operate this way. And I think I appreciate your push to sort of say, actually, here and now we should operate with the co-governance structure because it's better for people and it's better for
Right,
outcomes. You know,
right.
and I think the pushback against that is interesting because it feels like you have stayed true to your approach to the campaign once you've been elected, but that is not that while that may be an approach to campaigning that everybody likes, it's not necessarily an approach to governing that everybody likes.
Right, right. Yeah. But I think, one of the things that's happened that is kind of co-governance because I talked about, like, the parents. And so as the parents are having issues, they're telling me what the issues are, and then I'm managing it from, like, a constituent services perspective. But as I'm doing that, it's helping me see policy issues and better informing me of how to ask questions and the right questions at the right time.
Yep.
So so I think it works both ways. One, it helps whoever's, like, going through that situation currently, navigate it, and it also notifies the system like, "Hey, this is an issue. How many other parents are experiencing this?" And from the governance side on the school board, I'm able to, say, "Hey, like, this has been not necessarily like this has been an incident that I've dealt with, like, in the past, like, where are we at with fixing it systemically, like, not just putting a Band-Aid on that one single person's issue."
Yep.
And so I that's why I also think it's really important for the school board members to be involved in that process, and doing more community outreach because, yes, we are a governance body, but we're serving the people, and if we aren't meeting them where they are or letting them know that they can come to us with stuff directly, like, we're not hearing the stories on the ground.
And again, it seems like your approach of expanding who you talk to and listen to that you did in your campaign is probably helpful in this. There are a lot of parents who have students who are not, in fact, super voters who have concerns, and they need to have somebody they can turn to and express those things to. And, maybe in the pre elected school board, there were mechanisms for them to do that. But having you in that place and seeking that input as a commissioner, I think changes the equation, changes how things get looked at, and changes how things get evaluated. I want to move on to the student. I was about to give away the thing there. Let me say this. You've worked to expand and defend the power of a SMOB. What is a SMOB and why are they important?
It's the student member of the board.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so talk to me about SMOBs in Baltimore and in Maryland.
So I would say I can't even take credit for that. That was the youths. Like the way that they organized around the last bill and even prior to that, like the other pieces of legislation, I think it's really hard, like getting other adults to let youth lead. Like the youth are all right. Like, I don't think that we need to like interject and like so yeah, they organized themselves and they got this passed. So now our student member on the board has the last bill that passed, a student member on the board has voting rights with the exception of like personnel matters and I think the evaluation of the CEO. They can't vote on those two things. And it also created a commission to study whether or not we should have an additional student member, which is awesome because that's a model that I saw at University System of Maryland on their commission that worked really well. Having two students there, two different perspectives, and having student to student support amongst like adults was really powerful. And then I said the compensation piece, right, for school board members and yeah. So I think out of that commission, it's really gonna make the school board more accessible for people that want to serve on the board. But I think that when students show up and they have voting rights, it's just a different vibe. Like, it's not like, oh, you're just happy to be here. Like, you have to take them into consideration as you're having discussions about, policy things because they get a vote, like it just changes the conversation. So I think it's definitely healthy. And I definitely have been going ham in the past because I know in Howard County, the student member voted against reopening and everybody blamed the student member and was like, oh, they were the deciding vote. And I was like, their vote counts equally to everybody else's. Why was theirs the deciding vote? Why not one of the adult members?
Right. And
so, yeah.
The weird thing in Howard County is that they say that the student member of the board is the one that makes it even. Right. So I think Howard County has an even number of people on their school board. And so I know for a while they were tying on really important things. And I think the student member and the Democrats were routinely voting together and the Republicans were routinely voting separately. And I remember one of my favorite days of watching General Assembly testimony ever was when a Howard County delegate brought this bill forward in order to take away the voting rights of the student member when it was close. It was a ridiculous bill. It was like, if the vote matters, like if the students' vote matters to the outcome, then the students' vote doesn't happen. And so it was like the students could join 5-6-0 decisions, but they couldn't be part of a 3-3 decision or a 2-4 decision or something. It was a silly bill. But the students
don't play in their face. That's rude. Like
the students put together a master class in legislative advocacy because all the SMOBs from around the state testified, and all of these like Congress people and state senators and mayors and things like that were also testifying against this. Like I think Johnny O was a SMOB or something like that, and this bill came up and. It was like one guy from Howard County that's probably his donors told him to put this bill in because those conservative parents wanted to, ram something through the school board. And the students just smacked him down, like left, right, and center. And they were like, well, if you don't want there to be a tie, perhaps we could have 2 student members of the board. And it was just, it was fantastic to watch as a debate coach, to watch their arguments, to watch their policy analysis, but also to watch the network of people they galvanize to defend the student member of the board position. And I just think it's I love that they're called SMOBs because then we can always have the question of what that is. But I think it opens a really useful and important question about student leadership and about youth advocacy. Before I get to that though, how are they elected? How do the students decide who their member of the board is?
Actually, It's been crazy to watch the past couple years because they have like hyper democratized like all of their processes. Like we have the most number of active SGAs ever, and that really is attributed to like the students that served on ASCBC. Definitely the last commissioner, Ethan Ablagi, was like a big part of that, who is probably one of the dopest organizers, especially youth. Yeah, yeah. Like the way that they've just said, okay, here's how we like hyper democratize things. So the SGAs was a piece of it, getting all those activated. And now all the high school students can vote on who the commissioner is, the student commissioner. And now this year will be the first year that our student election is in alignment with other jurisdictions. So now our student member will be onboarded with other jurisdictions, because before they would come on during the fall, but they would miss like the student member orientation that was given over the summer, and just being able to make relationships with other student members like around the state or all over the state. So yeah, that's how it's working now. So we're actually about to have like the most democratized, timely, efficient student member election that we've ever had.
And that's excellent. And I think that expands beyond the school board's politics. That expands into other organizing spaces, and that creates opportunity for youth leadership. More broadly, like, can you talk about the importance of student leadership and coalitions and movements and in advocacy organizations?
I think there's something about being a young person, just like I said, my story, my what do you call it? I forget what it's called.
Your
Origin
superhero
story.
origin story, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So when you're younger, like you have fresh eyes on everything, right? So I think that perspective over time, we kind of get like in our feels, or stuff happens along the way in adulting that kind of either makes us like pessimistic, or I don't know. There's a different type of optimism that youth have, and telling it like it is. And I think that's why I appreciate youth and elders. Like I think that you need both. Like you need the elders to kind of like for that historical knowledge, but you need the youth to like hold you accountable, to be like, hey, this is whack, and also I'm not cleaning up your mess. So that's what I appreciate, and I wish people would not ask youth for buy-in after the fact, because that's one of my pet peeves. Like if you come ask youth for support on something that's already crafted by a bunch of adults, and then they just realize towards the end, oh crap, we haven't asked any youth their opinion. Like, don't ask them for buy-in after the fact. Include them in the process. In fact, take a back seat and
Mhm.
just let them lead the thing, and be that elder. Like, give guidance if asked, and if there's any legal issues, jump in or whatever. But that's how I think that people are so scared to do like a knowledge transfer and really build up young people to lead. But if we don't do that, like what do we do? What are you just going to stay in the seat forever? And
Right.
like that's why we have the situation that we have now, where people are like, oh, maybe we need term limits, not necessarily locally, but like on Congress and stuff. Like, um, yeah, it's just people get in a seat and forget to do the knowledge transfer, and then they get stuck.
Yeah.
But young people are coming in and they're like, one, I don't care what your rules were during your time. Like, we're going to come in, Wreck It Ralph, and create our own path and fix the mess that we didn't create, which is like bold, but also they shouldn't have to do that. So however they show up, people just need to respect it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think having an infrastructure like this democratized school governance and co-governance structure that you talked about helps to give people platforms and spaces where they can do that. As you know, I did debate stuff, and I participated in debate, and I taught debate, and I think well, it's different than student government. Having those structures that encourage student voice, student participation, and student action are really important, but almost as important is having structures in which adults have to listen to them. And I think one of the things that I like about the student member of the board as a democratic tool is if you didn't have that, um, the ability to have that voice be heard would be to the degree that adults wanted to listen. But because there's a forced position dedicated for that, like there has to be, you get to go. The person who's elected gets to go. They get to speak as a commissioner, and they get to vote. And
Yeah.
like that actual power vested in the student positions, as opposed to just power when people want to give it, I think is a really important aspect of that developing organizing culture.
Right. And I just, this is like bringing me into like organizing brain, but like I feel like giving someone a seat at the table without that power piece is just like exploitation.
Right.
Like, you know what I mean? It's just, you're here for the optics of it.
Right.
So yeah, we gotta do better, not just in this space, but just in general. Like if there are impacted people, youth are the most impacted people by our system. So the audacity of anybody thinking that, oh, you guys aren't mature enough to know how to vote, or whatever narrative they want to throw out there is just ridiculous, because we're supposed to be serving them. So accountability means giving them power to hold us accountable.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I remember when they were having this discussion a few years ago, Senator Bill Ferguson, who was a former teacher, made suggestions about what things young people should be allowed to do and shouldn't be allowed to do, and was suggesting that they weren't ready to do certain things. It's also interesting that at the same time
They can go to war, like they can
they can,
sign their whole selves up for the military and other
yeah.
foolishness. So
And I mean, I would also say Senator Bill Ferguson led
not
a
that military folks are foolish, like, sorry.
Yeah, it's all good, all good. Senator Bill Ferguson led a push this year to incarcerate more and younger children as part of a juvenile crime package that says that 10 and 12-year-olds can be brought into the criminal justice system. And I would sort of say the age at which you charge a child as an adult is the age at which you should start to give children the power to make decisions on commissions and boards like this one. And so we're more than happy in this state to charge 10-year-olds or to bring 10-year-olds into the juvenile justice system. We should also be more than happy to bring young people into the school board decisions and into co-governance within their schools. And I think that
maybe we need some student or youth delegates,
right,
senators.
yeah, I mean, I think it would be valuable to have youth in positions beyond just the school board, because decisions. It's important to understand that decisions that are made by the school board affect young people, but young people's lives are not defined entirely by education. They exist as people in a society outside of school, and we should expand that co-governance to include young people in all sorts of aspects of life. We can't just let education policy be youth policy, and we need to take a look, I think, at the way that we've democratized schools and create a decision-making power for student members, and think about how to expand that beyond that and give students more voting power and more governing power.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned that you're a graduate of UMGC, and I'm currently enrolled in UMGC right now. I too went through more colleges than I
and
cared.
shout out to Keisha Allen. She's also at UMGC.
Excellent. And so I too went through more colleges than I preferred to when I was in the age of most college students, but I'm really excited going back right now. I really love it. I love the online experience, and I think I didn't think I'd love online learning at first, but I really do enjoy the virtualness of it. It works for me in a lot of ways. Can you explain why you think virtual education is important from UMGC or beyond?
So there's several things. Like when I was talking about community work, there's folks, when the pandemic happened, that made it clear there are more folks that can plug in by having an access to a virtual or hybrid environment. And the same is absolutely true with education at all levels. So when we're talking about kids that have medical issues or maybe have anxiety, there's some times in my childhood where I absolutely would have done better in school had I had a virtual environment, which didn't exist at the time, just because I had other stuff I was dealing with. So for me, UMGC really came at a good time because I got my diagnosis through that. Like, so my husband is a former paraeducator for special education. And, I was like struggling reading. He's always like helped me read and stuff. Like, usually when I do speeches and stuff, like the amount of preparation to read words is like a lot because I'm dyslexic and also have ADHD and some other stuff. So, um, having that virtual environment just to work at my own pace was really helpful. But when UMGC took their entire library, all their books for every course, and made it virtual, and um, made it possible for me to use a screen reader to process materials and keep up with my courses, and also have some other accommodations, like, that was life changing. Like, I mean, I went from almost failing out of UMGC to making the dean's list. Like, and it made me so sad because I was like, dag, like, if I would have known that I had these things, because he was like, what you're reading doesn't say any of that. So he's the one that really led to me getting the diagnosis. But just I think about how different my life would have been with accommodations, and how many other adults have found their way to UMGC, for all types of accommodations, like having kids or traveling or being military. There's a huge military population. It makes education more accessible. And
Yeah.
so I think that you have to have both. There's some people that are going to thrive in a traditional environment, but you also have to have something for the folks that need just a different way of learning.
Yeah, and I like this is a place where I think all of the above makes sense. I think it makes sense to be able to say, if you learn better, if the goal of a school system or a college or a university system is to help people learn, and to graduate, and if there's people for whom that is better in a virtual setting, we should do what we can to make sure that's a quality setting, and that setting is available. And I think it just makes so much sense. I think so many of the discussions at school boards around the country around the pandemic have focused on this question of, did schools close down for too long in 2020? Was virtual good? And of course, doing all of one or all of another is not going to be good for anybody. It's not going to be good for everybody. But an approach that says, let's make the best educational means and form available to as many people as we can, I think is a good one. And I really appreciate, I don't know what would happen if I tried to go to campus right now. I'm so busy with work and with other things in life that I don't know that I would have the kind of educational experience on a campus that I would have if I were, at a place like UMGC. So I'm very excited about it. I want to ask a couple of questions about local progress, and then I want to close out and talk about
Yeah.
organizing a little bit. So you're a local progress school board steering committee member. Can you tell us about local progress and what the work of what they're doing to talk about school boards?
Yeah, so I'm part of the first steering committee cohort. Yeah, like that was pretty amazing because I applied from the same lens as I ran, like recognizing that people like me don't typically serve on school boards, and showing back up as someone that the education system didn't serve. And so, I know they had a bunch of people that applied to it, and thankfully I got on there. And one of the things that I'm super proud of is we created a statement of values, to really like name what's going on in the education system, like across the country, and like where we're standing firm. And that that was a long process. Like we're all from all over the place, all over the country, but we had one convening here in the city where school board members came from around the country here to like do school visits, and we got to, you know, do workshops together. And that's kind of where our statement of values also was kind of brainstormed too. But local progress more broadly supports progressive elected officials all over. I think locally it's Odette or Councilwoman Ramos, Burnett, and others who are represented by local progress support. So the the thing that's powerful that they do is that if you're working on something policy-wise, like, they can step in and provide resources, help do research, but also you just have a network of folks to ask questions, and I've really leaned on the steering committee a lot. I'm like, "Hey, this is going on," without, like, giving, like, too much information, but just being like, "How do I navigate this?" Um, yeah, just having a values-aligned group to talk about school board stuff and share ideas about how we're, like, navigating it during this time is really helpful.
Yeah, especially like if we are seeking as progressives and as grassroots organizers to elect people who are not um, who break the mold a little bit. We need to also provide those folks resources when they get elected in order to do the work of governing. And I love that I love an organization like Local Progress that will say, "Hey, once you get into that, once you win that race, we're here to help you govern in line with these values. We're here to get you those resources that you may have a good idea for, but may not have the resources to go do all the research or to look at all the other, to know everybody else who's doing it." And connecting those folks around the country who are progressive educators and progressive school board members, I think, is a really great expansion for local progress. So you talked about there's a value statement there that says what a grassroots and progressive school board movement can look like. What are some of the values that you hold out of that and that came out of that statement?
Definitely the accessibility piece is really important, and I think one of the values says that, schools are the bedrock of democracy, and I definitely agree with that, like mentioned before, like, all the work that the SGAs are doing, like, getting youth, like, civically engaged, like, so that's, like, where it really starts, like, you have to have, historical context, a proper education, and, um yeah, just your first exposure to, like, a democratic process to have a future generation that's gonna be more civically engaged, so, yeah, I think those 2 things are and accessibility also includes, like, LGBTQIA, communities, English language learners, and undocumented folk, like, just everybody. Like, accessibility isn't just, like, special education, like, I think but the way that we framed it, we had it, include, accessibility broadly so that all those groups have all the resources that they need to get an education, so I think those are probably my favorite ones.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think I will. Is that statement available? Is the statement of values available on
Yeah,
the website?
it's public, so I can send it to you.
Excellent. I will put it in the comments of this so that people can track it down. But I think something like that is really useful, especially when we're in a context right now where so much of the fury and sound around school boards is coming from the right and is coming from what are often, I think, like astroturfed groups that are sometimes tapping into real concerns, but they're doing it for their own interests instead of for the interests of students and communities. And I think having something like Local Progress there to provide a resource for, progressive and grassroots movement focused school board members is a great way to fight back about that. And I'll definitely share that so folks can see those values. I want to get a little bit more abstract here as we start to approach the hour, and ask you about your approach to organizing and building power. Femi Tewu, who's an author I really like, talks about how we need to get past the concept of being in the rooms where it happens and center our politics on people who are not even in the room, and to push out so that we're beyond just being in the room, but in going out, pushing the walls down. I think this is a thing that you've done really well. And can you talk about generally, as we're getting ready to close, thoughts on how we ground politics in communities and disrupt the status quo by listening to the people who aren't listened to and talking to the people who aren't talked to?
I think that especially if you find yourself in a leadership role, if you have power, question how you can give up the power. And I know that sounds like so backwards. um like I'll use this as an example. So community association shenanigans. Community associations across the city can put something on a letterhead and, initiate a rezoning or support a developer that, approached people at a certain meeting and wooed the people that just happened to be there at that time. So situations like that, when I saw that that's where the power was, I was like, how do I not have the power? Like, how do I give this up? And one of the things that we did is we said, "Hey, we're not giving you anything on letterhead. Instead, um, we're gonna have several sessions where you got to present to the community. You got to get their buy-in." In one case, our neighbors heard this plan and they were like, "Oh heck no!" And not only did we share it in the meeting space, it's also important to share it asynchronously. So we made it available on the website. We put it in a newsletter. There was more time allotted for people to engage with it and give their opinions. And oh yeah, all heck broke loose. They were like, absolutely not. So, I think one of the highlights of Violetville shenanigans is us killing like a Royal Farms deal, because it would have been literally the biggest Royal Farms in this city. It looked like a rest stop, but my neighbors were like, nope. But had we used our power in the way that it was told to us that we had it, which is letterhead, a handful of people could have caused a lot of damage to an entire community. So how do you give up the power and like punt it to the majority of
Push
the
it
people?
out.
Wherever the majority of the people are, give it to them. And in another case, what we did is we told the developer that they had to contact the communities that were adjacent to the property via mailers, invest in mailers, send it to every household, have listening sessions, allow people to take a survey, whatever. They did the process and they were able to get support for it, because in that case, our community was kind of split 50-50. Some people were like, oh, that sounds like a good idea. Some people were like, eh. So that was kind of like a solution because we were like at an impasse. So yeah, that's really my advice for power is when you have it, if you are a person by yourself with power, think about who it impacts and think about how to include them in the decision, not just include them in the decision making process, but allow them to make the decision and then, you know, just speak to whatever decision they made.
Yeah, facilitate the pushing of the power out to the
Right.
people so that they can decide instead of you deciding. I've been in so many of these community association meetings here in Baltimore where they have this sort of quasi-official role, and there will be 6 people in a room that represent 6,000 people, and somebody trying to get something for their business will come and ask for their support. And those 6 people will make a vote and they will agree to it, and then there will be a new whatever in the neighborhood, and it will be, and the organization that's seeking to build it will say, well, we have the support of the people. It's like, you didn't have the support of the people, you had the support of the 6 people who were in the room at the time,
Right.
and you use them as a stand-in for the 6,000 people that live in the neighborhood. And I love your approach here, which is like, if I have the power to make the decision, I'm pushing it out to the 6,000 people in the neighborhood instead of being excited that me and 5 friends get to make this decision. And I
Right.
think, that feels to me like that's something that runs through your school board work, through your community association work, and through your movement work, is engaging the people who nobody's talking to, listening to the people that nobody's listening to, and making sure that everybody gets to co-govern and share the power. And I really like the way that you've taken that from an idea that happened in your community association to being, a citywide elected official on a national board implementing that. I want to ask one last question
Oh,
before
can
we.
I add one thing though,
Yeah, of
like
course
to
you
that?
can.
Because I mean, like with the school board stuff, I'm still developing the infrastructure for that because I do see areas in the future, especially like where, the decisions that we're making, like absolutely should be more democratized and have like community feedback real time.
Uh-huh.
Um, so I'm excited to experiment with that same concept, like on the school board.
Yeah.
And I mean, ultimately that only impacts like what I do, but I'm also hoping to like that's the one area that I've never done before is being in the middle of a governance body and the folks that I usually allow to like push what I do. So I'm still navigating that. So that'll be
Well, that's
interesting.
excellent. As you continue to navigate it, I'd love to have you come back and you can talk more about it, especially if you just, we can talk more about that piece of it. Because I think understanding how you navigate that once you've been elected, I think is a really useful question and a really useful concept to dig into. I want to ask a question that was inspired by some of our pre podcast chatting. Can you tell me two of your favorite books right now and why?
Ooh, okay. My Grandmother's Hands by Resma Menakem. I'm
Yep.
not sure how to say the last name. That one, oh my gosh, I've been doing a lot of work digging into my ancestry. 'Cause, I mean, my family, like, broadly just has, like, a lot of, like, trauma, like, there's a crazy history in my family, and so that was one of the books that I found out that's really, like, focused on healing your trauma, and it also talks a lot about multicultural, like, healing, like, the responsibilities of different groups in the systems that we exist in today, their responsibilities for healing and what that healing looks like. Um, so yeah, it's like a collective healing, and I wish that more organizing was, like, focused on that, because I think sometimes in organizing we get caught up and we're like, "Oh, if you take care of yourself, that's being individualist or that's being selfish," and it's like movement killing behavior. But I think if we all heal each other and heal our little families, that's like the world. So I mean, it probably sounds goofy, but that book has really inspired me a lot lately. And then
It
I'm trying
doesn't
to
sound
think.
goofy at all because Dana, my wife and our producer here, loves Resma Minikin and we've listened to podcasts, we've listened to books. I think she's taken workshops that she's talked about that are really inspiring to me. So it doesn't sound the least bit goofy. It sounds like an idea I've heard a lot, and I think is really good. And I think you're right on. That is like if we can do that, we can do the world. You know, it's hard work to do that, to heal our families, to heal ourselves, and to heal our communities. But if we can do that, then the power we have is immense, and will have superhero origin stories
Yeah.
after that. So
And I actually have 2 more books.
go
I know
ahead.
it's 2, but I have to okay. Uh, Professional Troublemaker by Lovey Ajayi. That one was, like, hilarious and so good. So, highly recommend, especially people that are, like like me, like, former folks in tech, especially, like, Black women, women of color in tech, like, that one is, like, really, really good. And then Un Unbought and Unbossed by Shirley Chisholm was, like, that made me feel like I'm doing it right. Like, when I heard, like, Never Wait Your Turn, like, because that's definitely a vibe because, yeah, like, I mean, there's so many people that when I ran for this that were like, "Oh, it's probably not a good time. You probably shouldn't not because you have a toddler." And even when I was at polling places, people would be like, "Oh, where's your baby? Like, who has your child?" And meanwhile, there's other folks running for office that are men that have kids the same age and didn't hear that. So that one really said it doesn't matter, like, if you are on an island of your own, like, there's power in that. Like, people will tell you that there's not, but being the dissenter when it's appropriate is, like, super powerful, and it kind of moves the goalposts for everyone else.
Yeah, those sound excellent. We'll look them up and we will include them in the links here that we send out afterwards. Um, is there anything you want to leave with? Is there anything that you want to talk about or say or draw people
Um,
to?
I would just say, I don't know. I just think I know a lot of folks are, like, trying to find ways to, like, plug into organizing or fixing. Everything feels icky, and everyone's looking for, like, "How do I fix this? I need to do something, or I'm not doing enough." One, like, taking care of yourself is not selfish, like, you have to do both, like, you can show up in spaces, and, show up to rallies and stuff, but also I guess I'd wanna encourage people to not just interact with folks that disagree or that agree with them, because that's one thing that I also do a lot is talk to folks that are completely polar opposite of me, both in their, like, background or ideology, and for me, that really gives me a lot of information about like how they came to think the way that they do or understand the way the world and the way that they do. And I also think that like a lot of times we're missing compassion and empathy. Like, of course, we should hold folks accountable for all the isms and not let that slide. But you can have accountability, but you also need to like build some type of infrastructure for like conflict resolution, like build the muscle to have conflict and work through it. Cause from my personal experience, once you get on the other side of it, it's really powerful. Like there's a lot of growth that happens for like both people. Even if you come to the point where you don't agree, like I would just encourage people to get out of their bubbles, don't be so conflict averse and talk to people. Be normal. Like be cool. Just be cool.
Talk to people. Talk to people. Talk to people. Listen to people. Seems like a really good takeaway from this. And Ash, how can people get in touch with you? How can they follow you? How can they, see your
Oh,
work?
yeah, if you go to my website, ashleyesposito.com, it has all my social media stuff on there. My email is esposito for board, FORBOARD at gmail.com. Um, yeah. And I'm usually on everything. Like, yeah.
Excellent. Well,
I enjoy social media.
we will put those social links and those website links into the chat. Ash, this has been a great conversation. I really enjoyed the time that we've had tonight to talk about it. I'd love to have you come back on, and anytime you like, we can talk about other things. We can talk about nerding out on campaign data or what this co-governance model looks like for you as you're moving forward with the school board stuff. But it's just been great. I really appreciate it. Thank you for coming on tonight. I hope you can come again soon.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I've really enjoyed the past what are they called? The past sessions that you've had with other folks too. I've been following along. So I appreciate you like creating this space to have these conversations.
Yeah, thank you. I'm enjoying it. I'm glad to hear you're enjoying it too. And the more people I talk to, the more folks I hear that are just like, yeah, it's really great to hear from folks talking about what they know and what they do for an hour. And that's the space that I like to facilitate. Is like, right, you talk about what you do, what you know, and what advice you have. And I think it's made a great show. I think this episode has been really good. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good night.
You too. All right. Well, thank you very much. This was a great show. I really appreciate having Ash come on tonight to talk about it. We'll get those links in there for all the resources that she mentioned. You'll be able to see those in the comments, and you'll be able to see how to get in touch with her that way too. We have some great shows coming up here in April and in May. We're going to talk a lot about education, and we're going to move from here. We're going to talk about community colleges. We're going to talk more about higher ed. And I think there's some really good conversations coming up in the next month. We also have some more conversations about political science and understanding the role of third parties in multi-party democracy. So, keep tuning in. Follow us on your favorite podcast platform. I think Spotify, Podbean, Apple Music, Audible, all these different things. Anywhere where you get a podcast, you can get us. So thank you very much. Thank you for tuning into the Go Green 2026 podcast tonight. And with that, we'll go ahead and say good evening and good night.